Okay, today we begin the new Masekhet Eruvin, which it's very exciting to be starting our third Masekhet since we began the Daf Yomi in fall, or actually in the summer. We start in August. And Eruvin is a challenging Masekhet mainly because there's a lot of visualization that goes into it in terms of structures and pictures and designs and setups. And so many of us are equipped with nice pictorial editions. So I see that Rabbi Ben is taking out his Steinsaltz. I have here the Ma'or, which also has very lovely pictures, as you could see in the back of the Talmud, which is the same as that. It's the same, but it's inside the Masechet. So it's very, very nice. So we won't need that today, but as we move forward, we may need it to help us visualize some of the scenarios. Now, Masekhet Eruvin is very clearly a continuation of Masekhet Shabbat in many ways, particularly because it is deals with Hilchot Shabbat, but special areas of Hilchot Shabbat. In particular, it's going to deal with the malacha of carrying, if you hadn't had enough of that already, which you have a tremendous amount in Masechet Shabbat. You get even more in Masechet Eruvin, but in particular, with areas that it's permitted to carry min HaTorah, but the rabbis prohibited carrying unless certain tikkunim, unless certain special arrangements were made. And that's what we're going to get into in today's daf, but in the future we'll get to other areas of limits on Shabbat, particularly Eruvei Techumin. Eruvei Chatzerot, of course, have to do with courtyards, and Eruvei Techumin with the boundary, the distance that one is not allowed to leave the one city on Shabbat. So Eruvin means many things. That's why it's in the plural, Eruvin, because there's many different types of Eruvin. There's Eruvei Chatzerot, there's Eruvei Techumin, and so on. And we'll see more as we move forward. But today we're going to talk about a very simple case. This is a case that we've seen actually many times in Masechet Shabbat itself. We don't even really need a pictorial version of it to give us an idea. But since we have the benefit of these lovely pictures, why not use them, right? So to show you, we're talking about a mavoi. A mavoi is, now the Talmudic neighborhood was structured in a setup that had courtyards and mavoot, which means that what it had was, let's say, imagine you live in a gated community. Okay, so you live in, but it was walled. So you lived in a walled community. So many houses open to what was called a chatzer. A chatzer was the shared sort of gated community area that everybody shares. And then, in between gated communities, you had a thing called a mavoi. A mavoi was like an alley, but it wasn't really narrow like an alley that we envision. It was a little wider. It was made for people to pass through. And when they would come through the alley, that alley would lead them to the main thoroughfare, to the Reshut HaRabim, which was not an enclosed place, it was like the marketplace. So if you got up in the morning, let's say, you have your cup of coffee, you leave your house, you walk out the door, you're in your chatzer. You go from your chatzer into your mavoi. You go from your mavoi directly into your Reshut HaRabim, which is not yours. So that's the important thing. Now, a mavoi is actually technically a private domain, because the mavoi we're talking about a mavoi that is closed on three sides and is open. So you would come, let's say, from the left side of the mavoi, and your friend who lived in the next courtyard would come from the other side, and then, and so on, and maybe further up there was another entrance from some other chatzer or whatever, and they would go from this mavoi that was shared by many chatzerot into the public domain. Now the thing is that the mavoi itself is not a public domain from the Torah because it's enclosed on three sides. It's only open on one end, the one end that enters into the public domain. Now that's a problem because so biblically speaking, one could carry in the chatzer, but you need an eruvei chatzerot, which we'll learn more about. We've talked about before, and we'll learn more about in this masechet. To carry in the mavoi also, you need what's called shitufei mavoot. You need something similar to an eruv chatzerot, to eruvei chatzerot, but it's not exactly the same thing. But it's a way of just like everybody who lives in the chatzer has to combine together to make eruvei chatzerot to permit everybody to carry in the chatzer. So too does all the different chatzerot, all the different courtyards have to combine together to allow them to carry in the mavoi. But there's another thing, which is that if you're carrying in the mavoi, there's a very real concern. What's the concern? You're carrying your keys in the mavoy and you walk right out of that mavoy and you just walked from what is biblically a private domain into what's biblically a public domain. Because really, that mavoy, that place enclosed on three sides is really a private domain. You have your keys in your pocket. You walked from there right into the public domain. That's a problem. You can't carry from a private to a public domain on Shabbat. So what do? We have to fix it in one of two ways. As we're going to see, according to Beit Shammai, you have to do both of these things. According to Beit Hillel, only one of them. But what you need a lechi, a vertical pole on the end of the mavoy, or a korah, according to Beit Hillel, or a horizontal piece going over. And that's the first set of pictures in my Ma'or Gemara here. This is lechi. Lechi is a vertical piece that's on the side, and korah is what goes over the top. See that? Now, this only works with certain conditions, and that's what our Mishnah is going to talk about. So the rabbi said you need two things. You need shitufei mavoot. You need that all of the chatzerot, all of the courtyards agree to share this space as one. And you also need to physically fix the space so that nobody makes a mistake and carries from the mavoy into the Reshut HaRabim. That's a separate concern. So, the mavoy shehu gavoa lemala me'esrim amah. Let's say you have a mavoy that is more than 20 amot high. And if we're working with an amah being approximately 1.5 feet, so that would mean that we're dealing with a 30-foot high mavoy. Right? So the mavoy is 30 feet high, or it's 20 amot. What? No, it's open. It's open. So what do? Yimma'et. You have to lower it. In other words, it can't be that high. What's the concern? That this korah, we're talking about a situation where the way that you fixed this mavoy was that you put a horizontal beam over it to remind people, can't go out into the public domain. This is where it ends. Now, if it's too high, what's the problem? You're not going to see it. If it's so high, it's all the way up there, you're not going to see it, and you're going to walk right through. So therefore, Yima'et, you have to diminish the level. Now, either you can lower the walls, I guess you'd be able to do that, or you can raise the floor. But somehow you have to make it less than 20 amot. The same exact issue in Sukkah and Ner Chanukah. Same exact. They're always mentioned together. 20 amot is considered too high for the average person to really perceive something. So, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Tzarich. Rabbi Yehuda says not necessary. Not necessary. 20 amot is no problem. He says the same thing by Sukkah. Yeah, says the beginning Mishnah of Sukkah. Tosafot actually mentions why did the Mishnah decide to talk about what's wrong with a mavoy? It didn't even tell us the halachot of how to fix a mavoy yet. It said because he wanted to parallel Sukkah, same opening piece. So v'harachav me'eser amot. If it's wider than 10 amot, yima'et, also it has to be narrowed. It's too wide. It's too wide if it's 10 amot wide. Okay? And Rashi says that anything bigger than 10 amot wide is not looked at as a doorway anymore. It's looked at as a breach in the wall. So to make sure that it's clear that this is a doorway and not a breach, it has to be less than 10 amot. However, the Mishnah says that ve'im yesh lo tzurat petach, if it has the form of a doorway, then afal pishu rachav ma'eser amot in tzarich lema'et. Even though it might be wider than 10 amot, it's no problem. So the point is that if it's just wide open, you have a 3-wall, enclosed on 3 sides, and it's just wide open, and it's 10 amot wide. It's so wide, it just seems open. It doesn't seem like there's anything, because it's so wide. It's just a breach. That's no good. But if it had a tzurat petach, if it has like a doorway frame, where it goes like this, there's 2 vertical pieces and a horizontal piece, tzurat petach, then it's clear that it's a gate. So it's a big door, but it's a door. It's a doorway. Nobody's going to confuse that with a breach, just an open breach in the wall. So that's what the Mishnah says. The Gemara says, Tanan Hatam, we learned over there. Sukkah shi gavoa lemala me'esrim amot pesula. If a sukkah is higher than 20 amot, it's invalid. 20 amot again being approximately 30 feet. And Rabbi Yehuda machshir, and Rabbi Yehuda allows it and says that it's kasher. A sukkah can be 30 feet high, it can be 20 amot high, and it's acceptable. And by the way, if you're familiar with Masekhet Sukkah, you will recognize this exchange that occurs in the beginning of Masekhet Sukkah as well. Why is it that when it comes to Sukkah, Ditane pesula. The language is that a sukkah that's 20 amot high is pesula, it's invalid. Vegabe mavoi tane takanta. But over here with mavoi, it doesn't tell you pesula. What does it tell you? Yema'et, lower it. So why by sukkah does it say lower it? Or why by mavoi does it not say pasul?
It would actually make more sense for sukkah to say mad, because how are you going to lower the brick walls?
Right. I guess so. Yeah, it's true. Right. So what's the reason why it uses different language if it's the same point? Why does one called invalid, and in the other one it tells you advice, lower it, lower the height? So he says sukkah deoraita tane pesula mavoi derabanan tane takanta. The difference is that a sukkah is deoraita. We're dealing with the biblical commandment of sukkah. So biblical commandment, we talk about absolute categories, Rashi says. We talk about a pre-existent category. The pre-existent category that was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu about the height of a sukkah. So if it came down as a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, it came down as a standard that's absolute, that's carved in stone, if you will. So we could say pesula. In terms of that standard, it's invalid. But mavoi is invented by the rabbis. This whole idea that really the alley that's enclosed on three sides, you should be allowed to carry in there. No problem. So what did the rabbis do? They came along and said that you can only carry in there if you fix it, first of all, with the shituf, that you have to have the partnership of the different courtyards. But let's leave that aside. Now we're just talking about the physical correction, that there has to be some kind of an indication at the end of the mavoi, probably a korah, a horizontal beam going across, to remind people that that's as far as they can carry, that they shouldn't go past that into the public domain. So since the rabbis invented this whole thing, it's a rabbinical thing. Therefore, it says takanta, it tells you how to fix it. That's how Rashi interprets it. Tosafot doesn't like this interpretation. He gives a compelling reason to say that no, it's not that pasul would be inappropriate for a rabbinic institution. It's that teaching the takana, teaching how to fix it, wouldn't be the way to express the biblical category. Because teaching how to fix it implies that it's better if you fix it. It's not so good the way it is now. Right? You should lower it. You should lower it implies I'm giving you advice. Lower it. But really it's okay. So if they said that by sukkah, it would sound like we're playing fast and loose with the biblical commandment, saying, I'll lower it, but if you didn't, we'll give you a pass. So that's how Tosafot interprets it. But either way, they're saying that a biblical category, we use the term pasul, invalid. The rabbinical category, we say how to fix it. However, v'bait ema, possibly we could say alternatively, deoraita nami tane takanta. That even in a deoraita, we could say how to fix it. See, this supports Tosafot's reading. That what was the problem? Mentioning how to fix it for a biblical thing. All right? Even a biblical thing, we can mention how to fix it. But the difference is, if you look at that first Mishnah of Masekhet Sukkah, what do you find there? A whole list of problems, right? If it's too tall, if there's not enough sechach, there's too much sun, not enough shade, if it's too small, if it's this, if it's that. So because there are many different parameters by Sukkah, not just the height, but many parameters, it just wants to be simple, so the Mishnah says psula. Psula means it's no good. So we can give you a list. If there's this, or this, psula. Invalid. If for each one it has to tell you a different thing. Oh, if it's too tall, make it shorter. If it's too short, make it taller. If you have not enough sechach, add some sechach. Right, so that it's too complicated. And we want to be, Rashi says, Le'olam yishne adam letalmidav derech kitzara. We always want to teach students in the simplest way possible. Simple, brief, to the point. So we can summarize everything on the list by saying pesula, invalid. Mavoi, there's only one thing, the height. So since there's only one issue, the height of the alleyway, so therefore we could say how to fix it, because there's only one thing to say. Okay, now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda said, the Rav said, Chachamim lo lemadua ela mipitcho shel hechal. Where did the rabbis get this idea of a limit of 20 amot height? They got it from Pitcho shel Hechal. They got it from, if you read the description of the Mishkan, or of the Beit HaMikdash, you will see, there are different parts of the Mishkan we know. There's the Chatzer, there's the outer part that didn't have a roof. And then there's what's called the Hechal, what's called the Ohel Moed, really, the actual tent that had the covering, where you find the golden altar, and you find the menorah, you find the shulchan, the table, all of that is inside. And that inner part is called the Hechal. So most of the korbanot take place outside in the chatzer. But inside the Hechal, what's called the Kodesh in rabbinic literature, as opposed to the Kodesh of Kodeshim. Not the Holy of Holies, just the Holy, the Kodesh. So that structure was 20 amot tall. And since we talk about Petach Ohel Moed all the time, the door of the Ohel Moed, that's our model for a doorway. And what was the height of it? 20 amot. So if we're looking to define what's a standard doorway, 20 amot makes sense, right? 20 amot height. Because that was the height of the opening of the Hechal. And Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what, I agree with you. I'm also going to learn it from the Beit HaMikdash. But if you look at when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash, he built it differently than the Mishkan. The Mishkan just had a chatzer, an outer courtyard, which was where the korbanot were mostly done, an inner sanctum called the Kodesh or the Hechal, and an inner one called the Kodesh HaKodeshim, right? So, Shlomo HaMelech built something called the Ulam, which was when you came in, there was the outer area, also without a roof, just like in the original Mishkan. Then you went into the Ulam. The Ulam was the antechamber. And then you went into the Hechal. And the antechamber was wider and taller than the actual Hechal. It was wider, the entrance, and it was taller. In fact, it was 40 amot tall and 20 amot wide, instead of being 10 amot wide and 20 high. So it was double. So that's where Rabbi Yehuda gets it from. As we learned in the Mishnah, because it says in the Mishnah, the Hechal that Shlomo HaMelech built in the Beit HaMikdash was 10 wide, 10 amot wide, and 20 amot tall. The antechamber was 20 amot wide and 40 amot tall. So you went from a much larger thing to a much narrower and lower when you walked in. And both Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis are deriving their standard from the same pasuk, because they want to define what is a doorway. What's the standard doorway? V'shachatu petach oel moed, because it says they should slaughter the korbanot at the door of the oel moed. And they want to know, okay, so it's telling us what is the definition of a doorway, an entranceway. It's based on the Hechal. It's based on what we saw in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. Because the rabbis say that when it says that there are two things here. Shlomo HaMelech, when he built the antechamber, what was he doing? Was he extending the Hechal even further? Or was he creating a new thing? So the rabbi said that was just a new thing. It was just adding a piece of design to the Beit HaMikdash. That doesn't really count. You can't count. In other words, if there's something that has to be done in the Hechal, in the actual Kodesh, where the golden altar is, where the table is, where the menorah is, and you do it in the antechamber, it doesn't count. That's not really part of the Hechal. So when it says Petach Ohel Moed, also when it says the doorway of the tent, it can't be talking about the Ulam. That was something Shlomo HaMelech invented, okay? That wasn't part of the original design. So we ignore that. And Rabbi Yehuda savar Hechal v'ulam kedusha achati. V'chi ketiv b'dagol moed atar vayuhu dichtiv. And Rabbi Yehuda says no. That when Shlomo HaMelech introduced this idea of an ulam, of an antechamber, he was actually extending the identity of the Hechal. So since they have the same, if you had to do a certain mitzvah, let's say certain activities that needed to be done in the Hechal, if they were done in the antechamber, that would be equally good. So therefore that means that if the doorway of the antechamber is 20 wide and 40 tall, then the mavoi should also be able to be 20 wide and 40 tall. Not 10 and 20, but 20, 40. Yeah, it's a double. It's a double, yeah. So that would be the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda. He's following the antechamber. He said Shlomo HaMelech established the antechamber, so the Chachamim, when they defined the parameters of a mavoi, they went with that. So then the Gemara says, alternatively, the Rabbi Yehuda, nami kedushat ulam l'chud, kedushat hechal l'chud. We don't have to go that far. We don't have to take such a radical position and say that Rabbi Yehuda actually thought that the antechamber that King Solomon put in the Beit HaMikdash was equal in sanctity to the Hechal. We don't have to say that. Rather, that Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning is because the antechamber is referred to, and although this is not actually a pasuk where it says Petach Ulam Habayit, that's not really a pasuk. It's an amalgamation of various pasukim, as Tosafot mentions. There's not really such a place, but it's called Ulam Habayit. It's called the Ulam, the antechamber of the house, and oftentimes the opening is called Petach Habayit, the opening of the house. So he says, you see that the antechamber is really considered like part of the structure of the Beit HaMikdash. It also has a doorway. We should be able to recognize its doorway as well. Not that it's equal in sanctity to the inner place, but at least it's part of the Beit HaMikdash, and its opening should count. And ורבנן יבא כתב אל פתח אולם כדקאמרת השתא דכתיב אל פתח אולם הבית הפתוח לאולם. The rabbis say if there was actually a pasuk that said petach ha'ulam, that it was called the opening of the ulam, the door of the ulam, the door of the antechamber was ever mentioned in scripture, then maybe we would take that as our model of a doorway. But that's not the case. It always talks about the opening of the house, and it talks about the antechamber of the house, but it never actually refers to the opening of the antechamber. So what do we say when it says ulam habayit? When it's talking about the opening of the hechal, the opening of the inner sanctum, that opens to the antechamber. But it never mentions the door of the antechamber as one of the doors of the Beit HaMikdash. So that resolves our issue so far with the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda, that basically Rabbi Yehuda is looking at the antechamber as his model for a doorway. The Chachamim are looking at the biblically, originally, pre-Solomonic definition of the doorway, which was the Kodesh, the opening to the Ohel Moed, which was 10 in width and 20 amot in height. So now the Gemara asks a more general question about Ki Ketiv Hai B'Mishkan Ketiv. But all of these Pesukim, especially the Pasuk that the rabbis are quoting, this comes from the Mishkan, not the Beit HaMikdash. So why are we talking about the Beit HaMikdash dimensions and the Beit HaMikdash issues when this was all about the Mishkan? Petach Ohel Moed. When we say the door of Ohel Moed, that's talking about the Beit HaMikdash. I'm sorry, that's talking about the Mishkan.
In the wilderness.
Where there was no ulam, there was no antechamber, and not only that, that was only 10 amot in height. In the Midbar it wasn't 20, it was only 10. Only in the Beit HaMikdash was it 20. So if we're going to go by the Mishkan, we should be requiring the Mavoy to only be at 10 amot in height according to the rabbis. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, how can he bring the antechamber? The antechamber didn't even exist in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. That only existed in the times of King Shlomo. So we have two problems. So the Gemara says, the answer is Ashkachan Mishkan Dikri Mikdash, or Mikdash Dikri Mishkan. That the Mishkan and the Mikdash are interchangeable in the Torah, in Tanakh. Because if you don't say that, Had Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Shalom Mishachatan Kodem Petichat Dilatot Eichal Pesulin, Shenemar V'Shachadu Petach Ohel Moed, Bezman Shepetuchin, Velo Bezman Shehen Ne'olin. We have a halakha that says that anybody who brings a korban, let's say even a personal korban, a korban shalamim is a peace offering. He brings it into the Beit HaMikdash and he slaughters it, even though that has to be slaughtered not in the Hechal. You don't go into the inner sanctum to slaughter that. No slaughtering is done in there ever, actually. It's done in the courtyard. But the doors of the Hechal have to be opened. They were opened each morning. They have to be opened. That's the door that goes into the Kodesh, and of course from there there's the Parochet, there's the curtain that leads into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. It has to be open. Okay? So what is the halacha? If you slaughter a korban, it has to be El Petach Ohel Moed. It has to be facing the doors of the enclosed and the roofed part of the Mishkan. Which means the doors have to be open. But wait a second. There's a problem. But that pasuk is not talking about the times of the Beit HaMikdash. That's talking in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. When it says that you have to slaughter the korban at the door of the tent of meeting, that's in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. Did they have doors in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu at the Mishkan? What did they have? They had curtains, right? Exactly. So it's not relevant to say doors, correct? So, and yet, we're applying it to the doors. They obviously didn't hold the curtains open in the times of the Mishkan because there was no way to suspend them.
They said doorway.
It means a door that actually would be open, that would stay open while they were doing the offerings. That was a halakha that was applied to the Beit HaMikdash, but we learn it from a pasuk in the Mishkan. So therefore, what do you see? That rather we find that any halacha we learn about the Mishkan is applied to the Mikdash and vice versa. Sometimes we use Pesukim in the context of the Mishkan to learn something about the Beit HaMikdash. We apply it. So in the case of the Mishkan, maybe it's anachronistic. They weren't really able to have the doors open while they were doing the slaughtering because they didn't have doors. But in the Mikdash, where they did have the ability, that's where they did it. And in fact, it was me'akev. It was indispensable that the doors be open for the korban to be offered. So now, we find in Scripture that the term Mishkan is used to describe the permanent Beit HaMikdash. Because when Hashem speaks to the Jews in the Berachot, in Parashat Bechukotai, when he gives the Berachot, he says, I'm going to place my Mishkan in your midst. Now obviously he's not talking about the temporary Mishkan, because they already had that. And he's talking about the future. So what does he mean? He means you'll have the permanent Beit HaMikdash, and he refers to it with the word Mishkan. So we see that it goes that way. But where do you see that the Mishkan is called the Mikdash? If you're going to say that because the Bnei Kehat are described as carrying the Mikdash and setting up the Mishkan, which means that they carried the Mishkan and it's called the Mikdash, that they would carry the Mikdash and set it up. We turn to Amud Bet Hahu Ba'aron Ketiv. That isn't talking about the Mishkan. That's talking about the Aron that they carried. Because what did the Bnei Kehat carry? They carried the Aron. That was their job. So it couldn't be talking about the Mishkan. Rather, it's the most basic pasuk in Parashat Terumah. Ve'asu limikdash v'shachanti v'tocham. Make a mikdash for me. What is it talking about? The Mishkan. So we see that anything that the mikdash could be called the Mishkan could be called the mikdash. The terms are interchangeable. A halacha that's learned out from the Mishkan could be applied to the mikdash. A halacha that's learned out from the mikdash could be applied to the Mishkan. And therefore, even though the pasuk says petach is defined by ohel moed, doorway is defined by the opening to the kodesh, we apply that to not the Mishkan but to the Mikdash, and we say that it means 20 amot in height is the limit of a doorway, according to the Chachamim. Now, Tosafot has an interesting discussion here about the interchangeability of halachot between Mikdash and Mishkan, how it does seem that sometimes the Gemara will require a separate pasuk to establish that halacha is applicable in the Mishkan and in the Mikdash, and he says that it depends on the circumstances, basically, whether they have to do that or not. So, bein leRabbanan, bein leRabbi Yehuda, lilfu mipetach shar chatzer, dichtiv orech chatzer mea ba'ama, verochav 50 v'koma 5 amot. Because why don't the rabbis, whether it's Rabbi Yehuda or the rabbis, you have another standard that you could use, because there's another opening in the Mishkan. What's the other opening? The opening to the courtyard. Because remember, there's courtyard, you walk into the courtyard, and then from the courtyard, there's the Kodesh. So why didn't they use the courtyard as the standard? And we see that the courtyard had a length of 100 amot and a width of 50 on either side. The width was 50. Okay? And then it says, it was 5 amotai, uchtiv, v'chamesh esrei amah kila'im lakatef, uchtiv, v'lakatef ha'shenit mizem v'zeh l'shara chatzer, kila'im chamesh esrei amah, that they would have curtains 15 amot on each side. Now, if it's 50 wide, and there's 15 and 15, that means 30 are covered, and how much is the opening? 20. Okay, so why ma lehalan chamesh berochav esrim afkan chamesh berochav esrim? So why don't we say the height limit is 5 and the width limit is 20? We're saying the width limit is 10 and the height limit is 20. But we could use the courtyard dimensions and say the height limit is 5 and the width limit is 20.
It was an opening, and then there was a wall that was right outside.
What wall? They didn't have walls in the Mishkan.
But, I mean,
they had those pillars. They had the boards.
Right, but there was no gates.
And they curtains. They used all curtains.
It was all curtains, but that's different than the gate to go inside the Kodesh.
Not the Kodesh. Yeah, we're not talking about the Kodesh.
Right, so that's different.
No, they're taking a step back. They're saying, why don't we look at the courtyard instead?
Right, the courtyard. But that courtyard, I thought there was no gate there.
It's called a gate, but I mean, there's a curtain. There's an opening in the front. I wonder if they have a picture.
Isn't it shaped where it's open and then behind it there is a wall?
Look, this is what the courtyard looks
Right,
like.
so
see?
exactly. So
The Kodesh is in here.
Right.
Okay, this is the actual courtyard.
Exactly. So there's no gate. There is just a wall that's behind it.
Yeah, here and here is opening.
Okay, so
There's just an opening because there's no roof.
oh, okay.
Yeah, there's just an opening on either
You
side.
keep shifting back and forth between door and doorway.
Right.
There were points
Exactly.
before where you were saying
Right.
door is important. It's got to be a
Right.
door.
There's no door there.
Right.
He's saying there's
That's something
doors
else.
in
No.
the way.
That was something else. Before, right. So that was something else because the doors of the Mishkan, there's a halacha that the doors in the Beit HaMikdash actually had doors to go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim.
Right.
Doors that would open.
To go
Into the Kodesh, rather.
Kodesh, right.
Into the Kodesh.
Yes, right.
In the Mishkan, they didn't have doors.
Right.
They had curtains, and in the front, they had curtains on either side and an opening that you could walk into.
Right.
Right.
But there were never any doors.
No doors.
Neither.
No doors. No. They're using the term petach. It means an opening. Literally, it means an opening.
Okay.
So you could use the term doorway. Technically, it's not a doorway because there's no door, but it's an opening, entrance, an entranceway. So now the Gemara says, okay, so petach shar hechatzer ikre. That's called the opening of the gate of the courtyard. Petach sitamalo ikre, but it's not just called an opening. So it's because it's a special case. We don't generalize from it to other petach, other cases of petach, of openings. Alternatively, maybe when it says that those curtains are 15 amot, it doesn't mean the width of the curtains, leaving therefore 20 amot of space in between, of width. Maybe really, there were also only 10 amot of width. Maybe that was the same. And it's talking about the height of the curtains, that the curtains were 15 amot high. But then the Gemara says the obvious, but wait a second, you just told me that it's 5 amot tall. So how are you now telling me that it's 15? Answer, that the Mizbeach was 10 amot tall. So there were 5 amot of curtain above the point of the Mizbeach. But really, they were 15 amot. So he's trying to say now that the actual width of the opening would only be 10 amot. Therefore, there were 20 on either side in width.
5 by 20.
And 5 by 20. But it was really 15 by 20. The height was really 15. But when it counts 5, it only counts above the Mizbeach. So they're trying to work out a way that we could call it 10. So you have two ways. Either we can reinterpret the actual structure of the Mishkan to fit this bill, that really it was only 10. There was only a width of 10 in between, because the kila'im, because those curtains were actually 15 in height, not 15 in width. They were actually 20 in width on either side. Or we could just say that we don't learn from there because it's a different type of entranceway. It's called petach shar hechatzer. It's not a typical entranceway, and therefore we don't use it as our model. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda mipitcho shel ulam gamar. Is it really true that Rabbi Yehuda learns from the opening of the antechamber? But we learned in the Mishnah Varachav me'eser amot that if the opening is wider than 10 amot, yima'et, you have to make it smaller. Velo palig Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue in our Mishnah. And now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if we're learning from the opening of the antechamber, he should allow it a 20 amma width, right? 20 amot width should be allowed, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Abaye says, Palig B'Braita, he actually does argue on this. Tanya, it says in the Braita, Varachav miyud amot yima'et, Rabbi Yehuda omer eno tzarich lima'et. So he disagrees both with regard to the height limit and with regard to the width. V'liflog b'matnitin. So why doesn't he mention anything in the Mishnah? Why does he let it go in the Mishnah? He argues about the height requirement and says you don't need to. So why doesn't he also say you don't need to with regard to the width? Answer, Palig begova v'uadin l'ruchba. He meant for his comments to apply on both. He was arguing both about height and about width. In other words, he just made one comment that you don't need to do anything.
You should have known from the
right, and that's it. Right. So now, Rabbi Yehuda, does he really learn it from the antechamber? But we learned that that it says that Rabbi Yehuda allows not just past 20 amot, but up to 40 or 50 amot. Vitane Bar Kapara said ad me'ah. According to Bar Kapara, even to 100 amot. So wait a second here. Now we can dismiss bar kapara. He's just exaggerating. Okay, nobody's making 100 doorway. But according to Rav Yehuda, my guzma, is there really an exaggeration here? It doesn't sound like an exaggeration. If you're going to tell me 40, I can accept 40 because 40 is the height of the antechamber, correct? However, elam nun minale. But 50, where does he get 50? I'll tell you, Rav is making a mistake here, thinking that Rabbi Yehuda learned it from the antechamber. And this is the Braita that caused him to make the mistake. The Tanya says in the Braita, because in a Braita it was taught that if the height of the alleyway is greater than 20 amot, you have to lower it. And what did they say? Yoter mipitcho shel ulam, if it's taller than the antechamber in the Beit HaMikdash. And what did Rav think? So he assumed if the rabbis are learning this from the height of the actual hechal, then it must be that where did Rabbi Yehuda get his position? From the antechamber of the hechal. It makes sense, right? But the reality is, velohi, it's not true. Rabbi Yehuda is learning it from the doorways of kings. In other words, palaces have huge doors. He wasn't referring to the antechamber. So now let's go back to the rabbis for a second. In other words, so Rav made a mistake and assumed that since the rabbis seem to be learning this out from a part of the Beit HaMikdash, Rabbi Yehuda must be doing that too. But that's not true. Really, Rabbi Yehuda was saying there's no limit. He's not learning it from anything. He's just learning it from the kings, and they make palaces, grand doorways with no limit. But wait a second. But the Chachamim still seem to be learning it out from the Hechal, right? From the Beit HaMikdash. So if that's true, Allah Matznan, why do we learn Hechsher Mavoy Beit Shammai Omrim Lechi V'Korah Ubeit Hillel Omrim Lechi Okora? So wait a second. According to the rabbis, if they're learning it from the Hechal, why don't they require it to have actual doors? Why is it just a height requirement? In other words, how far do you go if you're defining Petach? You're defining doorway, your entranceway, by the entranceway of the Hechal. So why then is that entranceway not also required to have doors? If we're going to make an analogy, it should be a complete analogy, correct? Mm-hmm. So what does the Gemara say? No. Dilatot, and what do we actually find? That Beit Shammai say that all you need to do is put a cross beam over and a vertical beam on the side. And Beit Hillel say, no, just either a vertical beam or a cross beam. One or the other is good enough. You don't even need anything. A door, you don't even need the structure of a door. You don't even need a door frame.
It's just a reminder. It's
right. Yeah. So, but if you're going to go so far as to say a doorway is when you have what was in the Hechal, so why don't you need doors? So the answer is that the doors of the Hechal are not what make it be called a Petach. Okay? A Petach means an entranceway. An entranceway doesn't need to have doors. But Litzniut Ba'alma, for privacy, for respect, they had doors. But even if it didn't have doors, it would still be okay. But if that's true, Lo Te'anele Tzurat HaPetach. Ta'heichal Tzurat HaPetach Havyalo. Afilu Achi Eser Amotu Deraviah. There's a problem, though, that if that's the case, then wait a second. So why is it we learn that even if it's wider, right? Even if the alleyway is wider than 10 amot, what can you do to correct it anyway? You can put a door frame, right? You can put 2 poles on the side and a thing on top, and then even if it's wider than 10 amot, it's still good. But wait a second. In the Beit HaMikdash, not only did they have a door frame, they had actual doors, and it was still only 10 amot wide. And according to Tosafot, why was that? What is the Gemara's question? That you would think that what would Shlomo HaMelech have wanted to do? He would have wanted to make the Hechal as wide as the antechamber. Why would he want to make an antechamber and then a really narrow Hechal, half the width? He would have wanted to make it the same. It must be that anything wider than 10, even with a frame, is not considered a doorway. And that's why he wasn't able to make it any wider. And yet you're saying in halakha that with a mavui, you can make a door frame that will render even a wider than 10 amma opening a doorway. So how could that be? So the Gemara says, so that's what we said. Even if it's wider than 10 amot, if you have the frame of a door, it's okay. Why then couldn't Shlomo HaMelech make the Hechal even wider, since he had the frame of a door? Being wider than 10 amot shouldn't have been a problem. So the answer is, this is only relevant according to Rav. Rav being the one who says that we're learning everything from the Hechal. And actually, Hamatnele Rav Yehuda Lechia Barav Kamed Rav. Once Rav Yehuda was teaching Rav's son Chia in front of him. Rav was there, and his son was being taught. Eno tzarich lema'et. And Rav Yehuda taught Rav's son that if the opening is wider than 10 amot, and there's a doorway, it's still okay. Va'amar le, and Rav said, wait a second. Atniye tzarich lema'et. Wrong! You do have to make it narrower if it's wider than 10 amot, even with a doorway. So what does that show you? That shows you that Rav is a very consistent person. In other words, Rav is consistent in this. He holds that we use the Hechal as our defining model. And therefore, anything wider than 10 amot, even if it has a door frame, even if it has the form of a door, what's called Tzurat HaPetach, it's no good. If it's taller than 20 amot, it's going to be no good, because he's following to the letter the way that the Hechal was constructed in the Beit HaMikdash, and that's it. So he corrects it. He says it does have to be smaller. In other words, everyone agrees if it's higher than 20 amot, there's nothing you could do, except for Rabbi Yehuda, I'm saying. But the Chachamim say if it's wider than 10 amot, you also can't use that. You can't fix it. It's too wide. Right. So it's a breach. So he says, but if it has the form of a doorway, it's okay, the Mishnah says. Rav says, nope, it's not okay. Not okay. No, because if it were okay to correct a doorway, to correct something wider than 10 amot just by putting the frame of a door, so then why did Shlomo HaMelech limit himself to only 10 amot in width? He had a door frame. He could have expanded it to 20, just like the antechamber, and he didn't do that. So we see that 10 amot is the limit, even with a door frame. So Rav is very consistent, but we're going to see, as we move forward tomorrow, Bezrat Hashem, that the other Amoraim don't hold like Rav. They don't think that the rabbis were really sticking to the letter of comparing it to the Hechal. And therefore, they're not wedded to the idea that it has to exactly correspond to that. Rav, though, is consistent to the point that he corrected the Mishnah, basically, to fit with his conception of what the basis for the rabbi's theory was. And we'll conclude here for today, and Bezrat Hashem continue tomorrow.